How many actually came to the United States? I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody really knows, but we're talking about thousands. And at this point, imagine what we're suggesting. This man, Maduro, is still in control in Venezuela, and we're going to go through a mass deportation where we round up the Venezuelans who came to this country and send them back to starvation, political oppression. I get it. If you're a dangerous person, you never should have come to this country in the first place. And if you commit a serious crime once you're here, I don't believe you should stay. Just that basic. I don't go as far as the bill we considered a week or so ago. I believe that prosecution and a finding of guilt is still important in America that is ruled by due process. But having said that, what are we going to do about Venezuela? The same man's still there, and there have been not one but two rotten suspect elections in the time since I've been there. Last July, for example, Venezuela held another presidential election during which the regime arbitrarily blocked leading opposition candidates from the ballot and tried to undermine the electoral process. Nonetheless, more than 10 million Venezuelans actually voted, and results meticulously documented by credible election monitors showed a sweeping victory, not for Maduro, the incumbent, but for Edmundo Gonzalez, his opponent. I was glad to see that one of the newly confirmed Secretary of State Rubio's first calls was to President-elect Gonzalez, who actually won the election. Despite his sweeping and clear victory, the Maduro regime has refused to give up the office of presidency and refused to recognize the legitimate election results. The Maduro regime announced that it had won, actually, not true, arbitrarily arrested thousands of opponents, issued an arrest warrant for Gonzalez, which is becoming a common trick by these dictators, and refused to swear him in on Inauguration Day. So today I'm introducing a short bill terminating U.S. petroleum cooperation and related trade with Venezuela until the legitimate results of the election are respected. It's pretty simple. The entrenched regime clings to power using oil revenues, some of them from the United States. Under my bill, that comes to an end. President Trump and Secretary Rubio could also take this step right now without my legislation, but maybe the bill will be a reminder that this is a good idea. Lastly, I appeal to our democratic allies in the region, including the democracies of the Caribbean, to stand resolute in defense of a sweeping and clear vote by their exhausted Venezuelan neighbors. They cannot sit idly by for another 6 years of regime-inflicted suffering and collapse in Venezuela. Mr. President, on a totally unrelated subject, this week 2 Senate committees will hold confirmation hearings for Robert Kennedy Jr., President Trump's nominee to be Secretary for Health and Human Services. Every day, HHS, this major government agency, makes life or death decisions. That agency oversees the Food and Drug Administration to make sure that what we eat is safe, to make sure the drugs that are sold to us are effective and safe as well. The National Institutes of Health is in this agency. It is the premier medical research agency in the world. Some $40 billion spent each year to find cures, to find new drugs, to move us toward a better America. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Their job is not as flashy as some, but it's so important. What they do is to make sure that whatever is going around, as they say, doesn't hit our families. We count on them every single day. It's a big job. It requires responsible leadership and honesty to be overseeing an agency that has these critical agencies of government. Now, there may be some certain areas where we agree, such as curbing drug ads or improving the quality of the food supply. And I know Robert Kennedy Jr., and I've worked with him in the past. I can work with him on those issues. But on the fundamentals, the basic question of his leadership is troublesome. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is dangerously unqualified and entirely irresponsible in his judgment. He embraces quack science and cherry picks information to fulfill his numerous conspiracy theories. His decades-long crusade to spread lies about vaccines is just one example. Let me show you a chart that is pretty explicit, pretty short. Robert Kennedy Jr. There is no vaccine that is safe and effective. This man who wants to head the agency which develops vaccines and monitors their use said there's not a single vaccine that is safe and effective. He has stated that as recently as July of 2023. Contrary to scientific fact, he's also said that, quote, "I do believe that autism does come from vaccines." I've heard this theory and I think about it so many times when I think of my friends and families who are raising autistic children. What a burden, what a responsibility, what an effort they have to put into it to give these young children a chance. And to have this quack theory out there that this has something, their child's problems has something to do with vaccines is cruel. And an outlandish conspiracy manifesto, which he's helped to publish and wrote the foreword for, entitled Cause Unknown. Here's the book. It attempted to link COVID-19 vaccination and deaths in young kids. I'm going to put this up here. It's a picture of the cover of this book with a foreword written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's up for approval as part of the Trump cabinet, head of the HHS. The book's cover has a picture of a young man whose name is Braden Fahey. The only problem, this book, which is called Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths, and talks about COVID vaccine, Braden never received a COVID vaccine. This poor little boy died at a football practice due to a malformed blood vessel in his brain. And the book included his photo without the knowledge or consent of his parents, the height of irresponsibility. Mr. Kennedy pushes facts aside when he wants to tell us about his agenda. The Hippocratic Oath for doctors states, "First, do no harm." But I am fearful that if we put Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of our nation's health, innocent children will die. It's no secret what he would do. Mr. Kennedy himself petitioned the FDA to rescind authorization of all COVID vaccines in 2021. And a key associate of his is petitioned to remove the polio vaccine. Look over here to the pages we have in the Senate. I think of my own experience when I was 4 or 5 years younger than them. It was in the 1950s. We knew polio because we saw kids in our classrooms who were here today and in the hospital tomorrow. They contracted polio. It could be deadly. It could be crippling. It could affect you for the rest of your life. We knew this thing called an iron lung. It looked like a big vat, a big white vat, and the head sticking out at the end of it was this young person who had contracted polio. This iron lung was helping these young kids to breathe and stay alive. We lived in dread of the possibility of coming down with polio. I remember talking about it when I was a little kid. How do you get polio? Nobody knew. And then the day came when Jonas Salk, Dr. Jonas Salk, developed a vaccine that was going to protect us from coming down with polio. Later on, Dr. Sabin developed an oral version of the vaccine, which we kids liked a lot more. But the bottom line was, in my lifetime, in my childhood, we stopped polio in the United States. It was a vaccine that worked over and over and over again and millions of times over again. It worked. In 1952, polio paralyzed more than 21,000 Americans and killed more than 3,000. But thanks to researcher Jonas Salk, the vaccine discovered and studied among 1.3 million children. They did testing of thousands of kids across the United States before they injected all of us, and it was proven safe. The last case of wild polio found in the United States was 1979. That's over 40 years ago. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has spread conspiracy theories to discourage uptake of the measles vaccine, for example, including traveling to Samoa to spread lies about its safety, fueling an outbreak that took 80 lives in Samoa. Before the measles vaccine, 48,000 people were hospitalized each year in the United States, with thousands experiencing life-threatening brain swelling. By 2000, measles was officially declared eliminated because of vaccines. Mr. Kennedy's dangerous anti-science views don't stop with these obvious plus vaccines that have helped America. He has also targeted the fluoride in drinking water. We have been adding tiny bits of fluoride in our drinking water for over 70 years in the United States. We have tested it every way you can imagine, as we should, to make sure that it is safe for all of us to drink. And the tests come back suggesting it has always proven its safety. Why do we do it? It reduces cavities in teeth dramatically. And a little bit of fluoride can go a long way in that regard. I will tell you, it has changed dentistry since I was a kid. Going to the dentist used to be a not very welcome adventure, and kids went regularly with cavities galore. I was one of them. But the fluoride in water has changed things for my own children and grandchildren. It's safe and it helps. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. doesn't accept that. He wants to contest fluoride in drinking water. This man is not a scientist. He's a political figure, and I've known him for many years. He has no special knowledge or authority when it comes to these issues, and sadly buys into a myriad of conspiracy theories. Let's be clear, there is no evidence that current recommended levels of fluoride cause any harm. On the flip side, it's been established, as I said, for over 7 decades, that it helps prevent cavities and dental surgeries in children. God forbid we ever encounter another pandemic or infectious disease threat. Do you really want this vaccine denier, Robert Kennedy Jr., at the helm? I issue a challenge to my 99 Senate colleagues. Go ask your local children's hospital if they think this nominee, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., would help or harm the way they work to treat our children. I know what the answer is going to be. The United States Senate is better than this. I urge my colleagues to think twice for voting for this irresponsible nominee. The impact on the public health of America could be devastating, and we've got to accept the responsibility that this is the wrong nominee for this critical agency. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Madam President,
The Democratic Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I want to open with a few words on the announcement from China by DeepSeek. Today's announcement from China has been called AI's Sputnik moment for America. This announcement is precisely why I made AI a top priority in the last Congress and will continue to do so. Our competitors are going to use every single opportunity to overtake the United States' lead on the technologies of the future, particularly AI. And if Congress does not lead the way, we're going to fall behind. So I hope our bipartisan efforts on AI, which made some progress last year, will continue and even in a more robust way this year. Next, on the price of eggs. Earlier today, I was in upstate New York at two beloved family-owned diners, Alton's near Buffalo and Gines in Rochester, to call for an all-hands-on-deck approach to stop the spread of bird flu and prevent higher egg prices. For too many families across New York and across the country, far too many, have been shell-shocked by higher egg prices as more bird flu outbreaks continue to happen. But so far, it seems President Trump has not enunciated any plan to address the bird flu outbreak. He spent his first week pardoning insurrectionists, firing government watchdogs, instead of focusing on things ordinary Americans care about, like the price of groceries. The president owes the American people some answers. What is he going to do about the price of eggs that's been exacerbated by bird flu? When hundreds of thousands and even millions of chickens die, they lay fewer eggs. And when there are fewer eggs, the price goes up. The problem's reaching crisis levels. In November, a dozen eggs cost approximately $4 at a grocery store in New York, already too high. It used to be $2 a year earlier. Now, that same dozen eggs cost $6. And experts believe that the price of eggs could increase as much as 20% more this year if outbreaks continue, meaning that the same dozen eggs would be $8. Every day we hear about the spread of bird flu. Last week, farmers on Long Island had to slaughter 100,000 ducks. Long Island's one of the duck-producing capitals of the country, in response to another outbreak. So, President Trump, what's your plan to stop the spread of bird flu? The more bird flu spreads, the higher egg prices will go, and the less money in people's pockets for rent and gas and other expenses. We need some action. Now, luckily, we have some resources available. Last year, I helped secure over $300 million in federal funding ahead of the new administration to keep the government laser-focused on ending the bird flu crisis. And should the $300 million prove insufficient, I'll keep working in a bipartisan way to push for more federal resources in the upcoming budget negotiation. One thing is certain, we have a lot of budget cutters out there, none with a sharper axe than Russell Vogt. The Trump administration and Mr. Vogt should not try to impound these congressional-approved funds, because we know Mr. Vogt wants to impound in many, many places and not spend money that's needed. And this is a small but classic example of how the federal government's action, not inaction, can get your prices lower. Real action, spending the $300 million that we put in the budget in December, and more funds if needed, can reduce bird flu. The Department of Agriculture knows how to do it, can help farmers reduce the bird flu in their flocks, and get our prices of eggs back down again. Let's get to work. The money is there and ready to be used. We need the federal government to work overtime with experts in the coming months to keep the outbreak in check and keep grocery prices in check for families. Now on the IGs. Last Friday, while most Americans were asleep, President Trump conducted a midnight massacre of many of the federal government's nonpartisan, independent watchdogs. The president did not notify the Congress of his decision, as is required by law. The president did not offer any substantive explanation for these firings. Instead, the president simply said these positions were, quote, terminated effective immediately. This is a chilling, potentially unlawful decision by the president. It's a reminder that if there's anything President Trump fears most, it's accountability. He likes to talk about one thing and then another, and then doesn't like to be held accountable. When people stand up to President Trump, when people present him with facts and evidence that he doesn't like, his solution is to fire them and replace them with loyalists. I fear that this is what will happen here. Purging the government of its independent watchdogs begs an obvious question. What is the president trying to hide? What does the president not want the American people to see? Does the president want to avoid accountability for impoundment of congressional-approved funding? Does he want to hold up foreign aid as blackmail without getting caught? Does he want to eliminate scrutiny of improper government contracts? An independent inspector general could prevent many of these abuses. An inspector general's job can be boiled down to two words: transparency and accountability. That is what President Trump is apparently afraid of. But it's something most Americans want to have in their government. January 6th. For all the talk President Trump does about standing up for law and order, he spent the first few days in office doing the opposite, pardoning lawless rioters who invaded the Capitol and attacked police officers on January 6th. Today, I'm joining all 47 of my Senate Democratic colleagues in introducing a resolution condemning the pardon of individuals who were found guilty of assaulting Capitol police officers on January 6th. Senator Murray will seek passage of this resolution this week. I hope our Republican colleagues join us in condemning these pardons. Many of them saw the violence of January 6th firsthand. I did. This should be an easy resolution to pass. By handing out these pardons to convicted criminals, President Trump is effectively saying, you want to attack our brave police officers? That's okay, you're exonerated. The president is saying, you want to try and thwart our democracy? Fine by me. The president is saying, want to break the law and engage in political violence? Be my guest. One individual who received a pardon, listen to this, one individual who received a pardon was convicted of seditious conspiracy. A few days after the attack, he said, quote, his only regret is that they should have brought rifles, unquote. That man is being pardoned. What a disgrace. To repeat, his only regret is that they should have brought rifles, and President Trump pardoned him? Who could believe that? Who could believe in America that would happen? A few years back, no one would even imagine it. That's in some ways how our country has deteriorated, with President Trump doing what he's doing. The people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, whether they engaged in violence or not, committed a very serious crime. There's no gray area here, especially not when it comes to people who attack police officers. The pardons must be condemned by the Senate, and Democrats will try to do that through our resolution this week. On nominations, this week, 3 of the president's most controversial nominees will testify before Senate committees: Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, and Robert Kennedy Jr. All 3 nominees have deeply troubling backgrounds and equally troubling views. If Pete Hegseth's nomination process was any indication, these controversial nominees can expect to face immense scrutiny from both sides of the aisle and from the American people. Americans deserve to know, will the Trump administration strengthen our health and security or strengthen big drug companies and pseudoscience? Mr. Kennedy's hearing will give us answers. Also, we have to know from Mr. Kennedy, does he want to eliminate life-saving vaccines that have saved the lives and the health of so many millions of children in the United States and around the globe? Americans also deserve to know, will the FBI focus on public safety and rule of law or focus on Donald Trump's personal grievances? Mr. Patel and his hearing will give us answers. Americans need to know, will the Trump administration protect us from foreign adversaries and deal in truth and facts when it comes to classified intelligence, if there is ever a need for a fact-based agency, it's the intelligence agencies which gather information that keep us safe? Or will these agencies be turned to give shelter to conspiracy and misinformation in our intelligence? Ms. Gabbard's hearing will give us some very important answers here. The people entrusted to oversee matters of public health and law enforcement and classified intelligence should be beyond reproach. Their qualifications should not be in doubt. But President Trump has seemed to choose 3 deeply unqualified, deeply untrustworthy individuals to these positions. Like Mr. Hegseth, it's hard to imagine that they're the best for the job or even close to it. Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We commemorate it because it was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the few Jews who survived and were imprisoned at Auschwitz. Never again can we allow anti-Semitism or any other form of hatred to fester and grow the way we saw during the Nazi regime. We must always tell the truth about what happened to the Jewish people 80 years ago. We can never allow history to be forgotten, shunned, or deliberately erased. It saddens me this year. Holocaust Remembrance Day comes at a time of rising hatred against Jewish people, especially here in America after October 7th. Just yesterday, I visited a popular Israeli restaurant a few blocks from my home in Brooklyn. It's called Miriam. The night before, the restaurant and its owners were the victims of a despicable act of vandalism. Their windows were smeared with red paint and defiled with messages of hate. The attack happened simply because the owners are Jewish. Just because the owners are Jewish. That is anti-Semitism, pure and simple, and we must condemn it together, forcefully. As ugly as this incident was, I was inspired by how the owners of the community responded. They chose to leave the vandalism up for a day so that people in the media could see the dangers of letting anti-Semitism gain strength. Many in the area stopped by for lunch, offered to help with the cleanup, or just shared in a message of support. I went and visited the restaurant in the evening with an order to go. That is the best, that is New York at its best, when these neighbors look after each other in the face of hate. We must never, never fail to condemn anti-Semitism wherever or whenever it rears its ugly head. It comes now in many new dimensions. Some people seem impervious to things that seem to many Jewish people outright anti-Semitic. We have to be so vigilant. That's the best way to honor what Holocaust Remembrance Day represents. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks. Madam President.
The Majority Whip.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate now proceed to the en bloc consideration of the following Senate resolutions which were submitted earlier today. S-Res 39, S-Res 40, S-Res 41.
Without objection. The Senate will proceed to the resolutions en bloc.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the resolutions be agreed to, the preambles where applicable be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, all in block.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Madam President.
The senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
Yes,
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I rise today in opposition to Scott Bessent to be the next Secretary of the Treasury and in support of tens of millions of working families who need a government on their side. The Treasury Secretary is one of the President's top economic advisors. He has the power to lower costs for hardworking people or to give billionaires another break. Now, Mr. Bessent has a long history as an investment manager, helping rich clients get even richer. In fact, helping rich people get richer has been a very profitable business for him. Mr. Bessent is now a billionaire himself. He owns not one, but two multi-million-dollar mansions, including one in the Bahamas, and he has hundreds of millions of dollars in investments. Now, he's spent a lot of money, but he's saved money in one area. He hasn't paid the taxes he owes. According to an analysis from the congressional tax experts, Mr. Bessent has refused to pay $2 million in taxes that he owed on his hedge fund earnings just in the past 3 years. And Mr. Bessent has no demonstrated track record of fighting to make life better or more affordable for working people. So let's start with some of Trump's economic plans that Mr. Bessent would be in charge of advancing. Right now, Republicans in the White House and in Congress are working through their plans to extend tax breaks for billionaires and giant corporations, paid for in part with major cuts to health care. In plain English, Republicans are hoping you won't notice major budget cuts for nursing homes that take care of your grandpa or the cuts in school lunches for poor kids. Move grandpa out of the nursing home and let the little kids go hungry in order to make sure that a tiny handful of billionaires get a few more truckloads of cash from Uncle Sam. There's a truth no one can escape. Someone has to pay to run this country. Folks like Scott Bessent think the burden should be just a little heavier on working people because billionaires like him are smarter than everyone else. One place or the other, someone has to pay. So during his hearing, I asked Mr. Bessent about those cuts for billionaires. I asked if there were any billionaires already rich enough that they didn't need another tax cut. And Mr. Bessent said, well, that it was unwise to single out anyone, not even billionaires. You wouldn't want to single out a billionaire like Jeff Bezos, who pays a lower tax rate than a Boston public school teacher. You wouldn't want to single out a billionaire like Mark Zuckerberg, whose company Meta paid a tax rate of just 11.5% in 2023, despite making nearly $40 billion in profits. You wouldn't want to single out a billionaire like Elon Musk, who's more focused on flying to Mars than making life better for working families here on Earth. Those billionaires had better seats at Donald Trump's inauguration than Trump's own cabinet members. Those billionaires dominate the American economy, and Republican plans to give them more tax breaks. This is the payout for Trump's, quote, rich as hell donors. And Mr. Bessent is another billionaire ready to do the hard work of cutting taxes for every billionaire in America, himself included. The top economic issue today is how do we lower costs for families and build an economy that works not just for the wealthy and the well-connected, but an economy that works for everyone. I'm hammering out plans to make it a little easier for families to be able to pay their bills, to buy a home, and to build some financial security. Trump's tax breaks for billionaires is the same old Republican playbook of trickle-down economics. Help the rich get richer and leave everyone else behind. But that's not the Trump administration's only bad economic idea. Mr. Bessent has been an advocate for deregulating Wall Street and letting big banks load up on risk. Deregulate Wall Street. Yeah, a lot of people remember how that approach brought our economy to its knees back in 2008. People who remember include the millions of people who lost their homes, the millions who lost their jobs, the millions who lost their savings. And now, once again, President Trump wants to run that same economic play, and Mr. Bessent is the guy he's picked to do it. We don't need less oversight of giant banks and Wall Street movers and shakers. Risk is building in the system. The too big to fail banks are quietly taking on riskier investments. The shadowy private credit market has loaded up on highly leveraged loans. And after waves of catastrophic losses, the insurance industry is facing a reckoning that even climate change deniers can't ignore. Without significant changes, another financial crash is coming. As we learned, those big crashes fall hardest on hardworking people who are just trying to make a living. A billionaire willing to roll along on deregulation poses a threat to the economic well-being of every American. And a billionaire who supports more tax cuts for every single billionaire in America is not someone who is watching out for hardworking families. For me, this is simple. I am ready to work together with President Trump's team wherever we agree to help working families. But I'm also ready to fight like hell when Republicans pursue economic policies that load up the risk in our financial system or tax policies that mostly benefit billionaires. I will vote no on Mr. Bessent to be the next Secretary of the Treasury, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Madam President, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Will the senator withhold her request?
Yes.
Madam President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Madam President, I rise in support of the nomination of Sean Duffy to serve as our next Secretary of Transportation. Sean Duffy and I have known each other for many years and worked together in the Wisconsin delegation during our time in the House of Representatives. As a Wisconsin native, Mr. Duffy is a former congressman who represented Wisconsin's 7th congressional district from 2011 to 2019. And in that time, we partnered on shared priorities for our constituents, including the St. Croix Bridge in western Wisconsin. You know, during his confirmation hearing before the Commerce Committee, I shared this story. It usually does not take an act of Congress to build a bridge. But in this case, it was needed to build a new bridge over the St. Croix River connecting Wisconsin to Minnesota. With help from Senators Klobuchar, Cole, and Johnson, Sean Duffy and I, without hesitation, whipped our respective caucuses and brought together a House majority necessary to pass legislation to replace the 80-year-old Stillwater Bridge. As Sean can attest, this was a decades-long battle, which resulted in significant bipartisan win for our state and our region. It was not a matter of right or left, just what was good for our constituents, our economy, and our state. Today, the St. Croix crossing, which opened in 2017, has shortened traffic times, reduced congestion, and most importantly, improved safety. This type of bipartisan work for the American people is what I expect to see from Sean Duffy as Secretary of Transportation. Our efforts show that when we work together, we get important things done. And as I told my colleagues on the Commerce Committee about the nominee, we haven't always agreed, and I'm certain that will continue to be true. I will be the first to call out any efforts to roll back our Buy America rules or weaken safety or increase costs or cut funding for critical projects like the Blotnick Bridge in my state. At the end of the day, I'm confident that Sean Duffy is the right person for this job and will help deliver for Wisconsin families, businesses, and workers. He's committed to being a strong partner on strengthening Buy America rules, and I look forward to working with him on our upcoming surface transportation reauthorization. I expect that he will work with members on both sides of the aisle to improve our infrastructure and address challenges in the years ahead. I urge my colleagues to support the nomination of Sean Duffy as Secretary of Transportation. And now I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
The senator from Oregon.
Madam President, the Senate will vote shortly on
The Senate's in the quorum call.
Ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, the Senate will vote shortly on the nomination of Scott Bessent for Treasury Secretary. I urge opposition to the nomination. Here's why. First off, nearly $1 million in unpaid Medicare taxes. For the vast majority of Americans, paying Medicare taxes is automatic. They come straight out of every paycheck. Not so for individuals like Mr. Bessent. Those at the very top who operate under a different set of tax rules operate a different way. Mr. Bessent comes from Wall Street, To opt out of paying his fair share into Medicare, he follows a tax dodge that's common among ultra-wealthy hedge fund managers. They spend top dollar to get the best tax lawyers and accountants. They mash together loopholes and twist the law until, poof, Medicare taxes just disappear. Mr. Bessent has avoided paying almost $1 million in the 3 years of tax returns the Finance Committee has reviewed. There could be a lot more in other years. Now the Treasury Department says what Mr. Bessent is doing is a violation of the law. The IRS has gone to court twice to close this loophole. It won both times. We raised this with Mr. Bessent and urged him to pay what he owes. He said no. He's just going to wait out the appeals process, running down the clock in the hopes he doesn't have to pay. So if Mr. Bessent is confirmed the day that he's sworn in, the Treasury Secretary will be in violation of Treasury policy. Let me repeat that, Madam President. If Mr. Bessent is confirmed, the day that he is sworn in, we will have a Treasury Secretary who is in violation of Treasury policy. It is an absurd double standard to maintain for the benefit of one individual with immense power. It also raises the question, is he going to change Treasury's position on this issue, enriching himself and other Wall Street billionaires? Or will the Treasury and the IRS continue to enforce its policy for all the taxpayers of this country except the sitting Treasury Secretary? This was not the only tax issue identified in his returns. There were questionable losses from side businesses and a questionable debt write-off. We asked for documentation to prove that Mr. Bessent was following the law and paying what he owed. He didn't provide that either. The reality is what Mr. Bessent owes in Medicare taxes is a trivial amount compared to someone with his wealth. He could do the right thing and pay. He wouldn't even notice it. It's routine for nominees that come through the Finance Committee to have to resolve the tax issues we spot in the vetting process. Mr. Bessent has refused that as well. Second issue with the nomination. Madam President, I've seen a number of nominees, and I can't recall meeting one in my time on the committee who was more unprepared. He struggled to answer basic tax policy questions in one-on-one meetings and in his committee hearing. For example, I asked him a simple policy question. Should wages be treated differently than wealth? Madam President, this is a central question in the debate about taxes. When senators talk about the unfairness of the tax system, this issue I asked him about is the center of the debate. It's a question of whether the ultra-wealthy should get a better deal than the people who work for a living. Mr. Bessent fumbled, and after a bit, he basically just said, Madam President, that's the way it is. Senator Hassan asked the nominee another important issue about research and development incentives, matters that both sides care about. I know the President of the Senate and I have talked about that research and development issue many times. Senator Bennett asked about the unfairness of making cuts that will hurt working families and raise the cost of living, while Donald Trump's also running up deficits with the big tax breaks for the people at the top. Again, Mr. Bessent had no answer. Senator Warnock and Senator Warren asked about the wastefulness of giving tax breaks to individuals with incomes over $1 million, $1 billion, $10 billion. Mr. Bessent dodged. Senator Lujan actually asked about Trump cutting Medicaid. It wasn't clear, Madam President, whether Mr. Bessent knew what Medicaid was. Now, nobody expects nominees to be walking encyclopedias on every possible question under the sun. But Mr. Bessent's performance was, in my view, having watched a number of nominees, it was a new low when it comes to basic policy issues that are going to be at the center of the debate and the center of his job if confirmed. Even worse, I asked Mr. Bessent a simple question about the Trump tariffs. Who's going to pay them? I asked. Americans or foreigners? Mr. Bessent responded with a convoluted academic answer that covered for Trump, who routinely distorts this issue and has routinely said falsely. Donald Trump says foreigners are going to pay, not people in Alabama, not people in Oregon, not people in America, and it's just untrue. We're 1 week into the Trump second term, and already he's gunning for a trade war. That is going to clobber American consumers and small businesses, including a lot of farmers and ranchers. If anybody out there was looking for evidence that Mr. Bessent would be a check on Donald Trump's worst instincts on tariffs and other economic policies, it is sure not looking good. The third reason why I oppose this nomination is he's already ignoring congressional oversight, and I'll be brief on this. During the presidential campaign, a longtime Trump advisor named Boris Epstein ran a quid pro quo scheme. He approached people who wanted cabinet appointments, and he said he'd push Trump to nominate them in exchange for payments, adding up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mr. Bessent apparently was among the people that Donald Trump advisor Boris Epstein spoke to, according to numerous news reports. When the Finance Committee read about this scheme, it was clear we needed more information. We sent the Trump transition letters with a few key questions. Again, no response. I asked Mr. Bessent about it in our one-on-one meeting. He confirmed that Mr. Epstein spoke with him about payments for, quote, public relations, a sleazy way for someone in the inner circle in the Trump administration to pitch an obvious quid pro quo. As a major donor, we followed this issue quickly and actively because Mr. Bessent's story then changed in response to a written question. His new answer was nobody ever asked him about payments in exchange for an appointment. And even though the committee knows there was an internal investigation in Epstein's conduct, Mr. Bessent still won't reveal who else in Trump's orbit he talked to about it. So, my point of bringing up this issue, because we've now heard a response to the question 3 different ways, is it has never been more important for the Senate to stand up and fight for congressional oversight. Late on Friday night, Madam President, a couple of nights ago, Donald Trump fired 17 inspectors general, the independent watchdogs that we rely on, that every senator relies on, every Democrat, every Republican. The independent watchdogs were fired, the people we need to identify and combat waste, fraud, and abuse in the executive branch. The Treasury Inspector General was reportedly one of the 17. So let that sink in, Madam President. Here we are trying to get answers with respect to an individual nominated to head the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Inspector General was reportedly one of the 17 who was just fired. The Midnight Massacre, in my view, was obviously an illegal act by the Trump administration. My hope is, and I believe the court will strike this down immediately. Regardless of what happens next, it's obvious that the Trump administration wants to eliminate those people who are going to stand in the way of corruption and call it out. As a major donor and cabinet nominee, Mr. Bessent is volunteering to walk right into this culture of corruption that defines what we have just gone through with the Trump administration. For him to be shirking oversight by Congress before he's confirmed, even before he's confirmed, is just unacceptable. So, Madam President, these are the reasons that I oppose this nomination. Just picture what it's like to say to the people of Alabama, to the people of Oregon, all over the country, my colleague, Senator Crapo, the rules don't apply to the Treasury nominee. They just don't. You pay your Medicare taxes, if you're everybody else, if you're a firefighter, a nurse, or a teacher, but not if you're the new Treasury appointee who's violating rules that the Treasury Department has said he's violating. Mr. Bessent is cheated on his taxes according to Treasury policy. It would be a huge double standard, a major conflict of interest if he's confirmed and he can maintain his position that he doesn't have to pay Medicare taxes like everybody else in America. I've already made the point that he was deeply unprepared on many of the big questions. I will tell my colleagues, I don't even get the view that he did Prep 101, which is to go out and talk to senators about issues, and he would have heard from Mr. Lujan that Mr. Lujan was going to be interested in matters like Medicaid. That kind of prep is the easiest part of the nomination process. And Mr. Bessent has already shown that he has little respect for congressional oversight. So I think that this nomination is badly flawed. I hope that the Senate won't accept it. I've been through a number of those, and starting with violating the policy of not paying your Medicare taxes, this nomination, in my view, is an exhibit of what you shouldn't have come before the floor of the United States Senate. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the confirmation of Mr. Scott Bessent, who has been nominated to serve as Secretary of the Treasury. Over the weekend, the Senate voted with broad bipartisan support to advance Mr. Bessent's nomination. In fact, 15 of my Democrat colleagues joined Republicans in advancing Mr. Bessent's nomination. Despite Mr. Bessent's prolific experience and qualifications, which cannot be disputed, a few detractors framed their policy preferences, and I emphasize policy preferences, as if they are compliance issues with regard to his taxes. Let me be clear. Mr. Bessent followed all applicable law and met the Finance Committee's long-standing and rigorous diligence standard. The Finance Committee has the most rigorous standards for vetting nominees of any committee in this Congress, including looking at their past tax returns and having tax experts come in and evaluate their tax returns with us. His diligence matched that which has applied to nominees in previous administrations. Contrary to what you've heard, he provided extensive supporting material for all of the attacks on him, including more than 3,000 pages worth. And he and his staff spent countless hours with Republican and Democrat Senate Finance Committee members and staff going over all of these allegations and all of these claimed failures to pay taxes. He's gone further by not only divesting all of his business ties, which is no small task, but by publicly committing that if there is any change in the law in the future on these policy arguments, that he would comply with those changes in the law. But let me state this again as clearly as it can be said. Scott Bessent paid his taxes. I've heard it said twice on this floor that he did not pay his taxes. Experts have gone over his tax returns, and he has complied with standard prevailing interpretations of the tax code every time. The issue here is that the IRS wants to change the interpretation of the tax code. But the IRS doesn't get to decide what our tax code says. Congress does. And Congress has not made the changes that the IRS wants to see. Even in the face of that, arguing that he should have done what the IRS wanted him to do In fact, they didn't even say they wanted him to do it. They said it to other taxpayers, and other taxpayers have taken the IRS to court over this issue. But Mr. Bessent has said if the IRS prevails and changes the tax code, the interpretation of the tax code, he will comply. But the argument that he has not complied with long-standing tax policy and interpretation is false. And I don't know anybody who could go through a more rigorous standard than what we put him through in the Finance Committee. As for the nominee, Mr. Bessent has worked for the last 3 decades as one of the sharpest minds in the global finance industry. He has decades of academic, professional, and leadership experience relevant to the position of Treasury Secretary. His performance at the committee was stellar. His background and training are tailor-made for this role, and he has the demeanor and character to be an effective secretary. Mr. Bessent is committed to restoring the prosperity and opportunity experienced under President Trump's leadership. This includes ensuring that we avert an over $4 trillion tax hike on the American people if the Trump tax cuts are allowed to expire, which he rightly described at his nomination hearing as a pass-fail exercise. There should be no question that we will extend these tax cuts. I've also heard it argued on this floor here today that this is just a tax cut for rich billionaires. The reality is that the vast majority of this tax cut goes to everyday people, to people making less than $400,000 a year. And the $400,000 is computed by $200,000 per individual, so a married couple could equal the $400,000 level. The vast majority of those tax cuts, however, go to people in the lower and middle income tax brackets. The tax cuts that we are talking about gave tax cuts to every single solitary income cohort in the tax code, and the greatest tax cuts went to those in the lower and middle income categories. It would be terrible if we did not extend these tax cuts. And yet Mr. Bessent is attacked for saying he supports extending these tax cuts? It doesn't make sense. I look forward to working closely with him to make sure that we extend the policies that benefited Americans of every income bracket and enabled families and businesses to get ahead. I should also say that under this tax policy, when it was passed, the richest in America paid a greater percentage of the overall tax burden than they had before. Yet he is attacked for wanting to extend these tax cuts that will hammer every single tax-paying American if they are allowed to expire. If qualifications, and I might add character, are one of the tests for supporting a nominee, voting to confirm Mr. Bessent is one of the easiest that we could take. In previous Congresses, many of my Republican colleagues and I have voted for candidates we considered to be qualified to serve as Treasury Secretary, even when they were nominated by Democratic presidents and we disagreed with many of their policy positions. Mr. Bessent's candidacy ought to enjoy similar bipartisan support. And I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join with me in confirming his nomination. He is the right person for this job, and I commend President Trump in making such an excellent selection. Thank you, Madam President.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. And I've often worked with Senator Crapo in a positive way, and I know we're going to do that in the future. I just want to make sure that there's no confusion with respect to this Medicare tax issue. We've had a number of nominees over the years who have actually dropped out, and they have owed less money than, in effect, Mr. Bessent would if he was complying with Treasury rules. If he is confirmed, the day he is sworn in, he will be in violation of Treasury policy. And we will have established another double standard in the tax area that sends a message that if you're powerful, you've got accountants, you've got lawyers, you can basically figure out a way to not pay what you pay if you're a firefighter and a teacher. And I think that double standard is regrettable. I continue to urge opposition to the nominee.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent for just 15 seconds.
Without objection.
I'm going to state again, Mr. Bessent went through the most rigorous evaluation of his tax returns that anybody in America has ever faced. He passed the entire test every time. He has paid the taxes he is owed under the United States government's tax code.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to complete my brief remarks before the vote that is scheduled tonight.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise in support of the nomination of Sean Duffy to be Secretary of Transportation. Last week, Congressman Duffy was reported favorably out of the Commerce Committee without a single no vote. All 28 members of the Commerce Committee, Republicans and Democrats, voted in favor of Congressman Duffy. 2 weeks ago, Congressman Duffy appeared before the Commerce Committee for nearly 3 hours for 2 rounds of questioning. His family seated behind him, and he thoughtfully and ably answered the questions put forth by all of the members of the committee. The resounding bipartisan support for his nomination demonstrates that Republicans and Democrats believe Congressman Duffy is eminently qualified to serve as the Secretary of Transportation. Transportation is not Republican. It's not Democrat. Transportation is for all Americans, from roads to bridges to waterways to airspace. All Americans depend on the Department of Transportation to help ensure a safe and efficient transportation system. Congressman Duffy understands this. He is a 5-term congressman who reached across not just the aisle, but across chambers to bring home needed infrastructure to his district. To quote his home state senator, Senator Baldwin, a Democrat, who spoke glowingly of Congressman Duffy, quote, "Sean is the right person for this job." I agree with Senator Baldwin. As a father of 9 children, Congressman Duffy told committee members that, quote, "I think about transportation quite a bit, and about transportation safety a lot." He understands what American families care about, making sure that when they get in their car or on a plane or with their families, they know they will get to their destination safely. He embodies the, quote, "revolution of common sense" that President Trump has called for. Not only has Congressman Duffy earned the support of the entire Commerce Committee, but there are over 60 stakeholders in support of his nomination. Congressman Duffy has received wide support from labor, from airlines, from railroads, from manufacturers, from energy providers, and many more. It is my hope that given this unanimous support that Congressman Duffy received on Wednesday from the Commerce Committee, that the entire Senate can follow suit, that we can all agree he is the kind of consensus-driven leader we need at the Department of Transportation. Therefore, Madam President, I urge all of our colleagues, Republican and Democrats, to come together and vote in support of the confirmation of Sean Duffy to be the next Secretary of Transportation. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired, and the question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt.
Aye.
Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Britt, Cassidy, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Fetterman, Fisher, Graham, Hickenlooper, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Peters, Schmidt, Slotkin, Wicker. Mr. Kane, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Kim, Rosen, Sanders, Van Hollen, Warnock, Wyden. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Gallego, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye.
Colonel Ricketts, you are.
Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Also Brooks? No. Mr. Welch, no.
The yeas are 68, the nays are 29. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum call be waived with respect to the Duffy nomination be waived.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Sean Duffy of Wisconsin to be Secretary of Transportation, signed by 17 senators.
So this one right here. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Sean Duffy of Wisconsin to be Secretary of Transportation shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Thank you. Thanks, yes. Thank you. Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Thank you. Yeah, I got you. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. I will get him. Thank you. Thank you. Gotcha, thanks. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker. Yeah, I'll get him. Tuberville. I did, thank you. Did he vote? Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton. Thank you. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, thank you. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slapkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative. Also Brooks, Baldwin, Banks, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Britt, Budd, Cantwell, Collins, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Durbin, Ernst, Fetterman, Fisher, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Kelly, Kennedy, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Langford, Lujan, McConnell, Merkley, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Murray, Reed, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Sanders, Schiff, Schmidt, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Slotkin, Smith, Sullivan, Tillis, Tuberville, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden, and Young. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Curtis. Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Gallego? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Cassidy? Aye. Mr. McCormick? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Have a good evening. Thanks. Ms. Burkowski, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Thank you. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Okay. Haggerty, Cruz, Scott of South Carolina? Got it. Got it. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye.
The yeas are 97, the nays are 0. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Transportation, Sean Duffy of Wisconsin to be secretary.
From South Dakota. Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 8.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Environmental Protection Agency, Lee Zeldin of New York to be administrator.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Lee Zeldin of New York to be administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent to reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
Mr. President, I move to proceed
Motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 9.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of the Interior, Douglas Burgum of North Dakota to be secretary.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Douglas Burgum of North Dakota to be Secretary of the Interior, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent to reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 10.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Energy, Christopher Wright of Colorado to be secretary.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Christopher Wright of Colorado to be Secretary of Energy, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent to reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 7.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Veterans Affairs, Douglas Collins of Georgia to be secretary.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Douglas Collins of Georgia to be Secretary of Veterans Affairs, signed by 17 senators, as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent to reading the names be waived,
Without objection.
and I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Questions agreed to.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection,
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, January 28th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved today at the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume executive calendar number 6, Sean Duffy, under the order of January 25th. Further, that the Senate recess following disposition of the Duffy nomination until 2 p.m. to allow for the weekly conference meetings. Finally, that if any nominations are confirmed during Tuesday's session, the motions reconsidered be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
Mr. President, if there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask the Senate that it stand adjourned until under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.